everybody talks about humanity and being inclusive and all the rest of it, but then we have all these rules and regulations that prevent us from being human.
I grew up on, and then I moved.
The incarnation is that God became man as a man.
The world as it could be. Today on PECKHAM Podcast, I'm doing it remotely with a very special person. As some of you will know who may have followed some of these podcasts, I'm very interested in the question of community's future and community and faith being two bedfellows, necessary bedfellows. And I don't personally see, after spending 25 years working locally in South London, how community can work without a faith component. And I don't necessarily mean that has to be, for me, I don't think that has to be organised religion. It could be some perception of a greater value than just your own individual life and your own, perhaps, individual family, but something that can reach across out of one's own bubble into a greater bubble and on out, and it goes on forever, actually. So it's a great honour to have today the Archbishop of Selsey, Dr. Jerome Lloyd, come and talk with us and with me to rummage in amongst these cultural times of ours in which we see, some people call it existential worries about Western life. It's been going on for some years. It was accelerated very much by COVID and by George Floyd. Now we have the rather mysterious figure of Tommy Robinson, who is an arch baddie for a lot of people, and particularly in the mainstream media, and an inspirational and campaigning figure, a bit of a knight on his horse leading the charge. He would say very much symbolically, not literally, though he clearly does know how to look after himself and has got into trouble as a result of that. Provoking Tommy Robinson, provoking the West, deriding our history, these are all large problems, issues that come at one. And Dr. Lloyd, I wonder where we might begin, but I'd just like to draw your attention to something you kindly wrote in replying to my first communication with you. And you spoke of the erosion of historical confidence and spiritual inheritance. Now, these are two enormous pillars of our cultural world. Would you like to take that small? I've given you a bit of a hospital pass in rugby terms, but how would you like to pick up on those thoughts that I've laid out for you?
Yes, I mean, I would say historical confidence and spiritual inheritance, both I would say are symptomatic of an anthropological change that is affecting all of us. The very notion and understanding of what does it mean to be human, even what is a human being. If we think of the controversy at the moment around trans ideology, there seem to be people who are confused about what is a woman. Seems to be a question that even scientists, despite apparent science, have an issue with. I mean, I'm not talking about Richard Dawkins, of course. He quite clearly is gender critical, but we seem to have lost a fundamental understanding of who we are. Now, from a religious perspective, and indeed somewhat from an historical perspective, I would say that's because of the absence of God in our general concept that we have today in the zeitgeist about who we are. In times past, and for those with faith, we know that we are children of God, that there is a being who is higher than us, who is, ultimately our creator, ultimately set everything in motion, and in religious terms, of course, manifests his revelation, not just in describing himself, but also in his guidance for our well-being and our flourishing. That would be a basic Christian understanding of the Ten Commandments, for example, and the Jewish understanding of the Torah. Much of our law in this country is Judeo-Christian jurisprudence and philosophy and ethical philosophy. It's derived from a biblical worldview and understanding. And as we've become increasingly more secularized, so a distance, one might even say now a rupture, has formed, so that in a funny kind of way, we don't properly understand what it is, what our constitution is. Now, I know famously, we have no written British constitution, and I'm not necessarily talking about a national constitution in the first instance. Really, I'm talking about a constitution in terms of constituting who we are and what we are and where we're from, which ordinarily, of course, would indicate or imply where we might be going. This is manifested in particularly nihilism, or a nihilistic attitude among the young. Before, with a concept or an understanding, or at least an appreciation of God, people felt that they had a way of relating to or discerning what their purpose and reason for being in life might be.
You mentioned young people, Doctor.
Yeah,
The world of education seems to have been on a warpath against our
yeah,
past, and it's taken captive younger generations, plural, because this has been underway for a time, a few decades, in fact,
yeah,
of which I was
yeah.
gloriously unaware. But
Well, I think most people were.
hmm,
Most people were. It does seem to be ultimately where that effect on education has come from, is through the academy, through the teaching of critical theories to students, who then, of course, themselves become teachers, and then become professionals, and then infect, as it were, the education environment.
those who have studied our cultural history trace back 100 years to Italian communists and the Frankfurt School, and there's a whole logic or development which has been underway for a century. And
Yeah, yeah,
these things are very slow moving and, as it were, imperceptible, even perhaps for an entire generation or two, which was certainly the case
yeah.
for me, born after the Second World War, but not that far after it. And to wake up now at this stage of our sort of cultural development and see antithetical forces deeply rooted, that's very disturbing.
Very.
And is it wishful thinking, or do you believe that numbers are turning back towards church, and particularly the Catholic Church in this country, or is that barely measurable?
I have to confess that I am one of the most cynical on this notion of a quiet revival. I don't see so much the change in attitude societally that I would expect to have an impact. So, for example, Pew surveys of attitudes amongst Christians still show a majority propensity towards unorthodox or heterodox appreciations or perspectives of theology and doctrine, rather than a strengthening of traditional and orthodox perspectives on, for example, pro-life issues. Um, uh, so whereas, one would expect to see more, to see an increase in marriages, to see more younger voices campaigning on pro-life issues, um, and particularly on the understanding of sexual intimacy within and outside marriage. Um, I would expect to, I personally would want to see and expect to see some change in attitudes there, but we don't. We don't see that. Now, that might be because the numbers are too few, and they certainly seem to be, have been slightly exaggerated. But anecdotally, we have seen rises in baptisms and confirmations. Um, but as I say, I don't see that reflected in a change of societal attitudes, particularly even amongst the generation of where that revival is apparently happening.
The Church of England, however, is not going through a good phase and is perceived as somewhat lost, frankly, culturally. Why it thought
Yeah,
it should try and cash in and popularize itself by following social phenomena beats me, because there's quite a lot to concern oneself, even in just the good book of the Bible. One thing I wanted to explore with you in our conversation today was whether you thought it was possible for people, shall we say, to broker their own path to the divine, given that a spiritual dimension for life is obvious when you reflect properly and inquire. You can inquire academically, you can inquire philosophically, you could, in a sense, inquire scientifically. The arithmetic and the mathematics of creation are, are beautiful
yeah,
and inspiringly so. And the idea that accident drives all of this becomes more and more implausible and, in effect, more and more a nonsense. But I still am not drawn to go into a church. I did, however, visit your website just yesterday, and you were celebrating Saint Venantius of Camerino, a 15-year-old boy.
yeah.
Gosh, that was a tough story of his um,
Yeah,
torture and
is
martyrdom.
yeah,
Uh, but I love the music around the 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 mass that you celebrated and so on. Embracing technology to reach out to people and for people to connect in with you from how you're in the south of England. You're obviously a devoted man of God, and you've committed your life to your mission in the way that you now do. To what extent do you meet people in person, and to what extent are you, in effect, having to trade online with your mission?
the mass broadcast um, started long before COVID, and in fact, ours was the first channel to broadcast a daily traditional Latin Mass in the world since the Feast of the Assumption, August 15th, 2008. We've been broadcasting daily Mass since then. Pope Benedict XVI had only just given some relaxation to permit the celebration of the traditional Latin Mass more broadly in the church. But of course, that meant there were a lot of places that weren't offering the traditional Mass. So the idea was to broadcast it, A, for those who appreciate it and want to see it, B, for those who, for whatever circumstances, are unable to attend Mass in person, the housebound, those who are ill, infirm, elderly, etc. And then also, slightly evangelistically, for people who've never seen or heard or experienced the traditional Latin Mass, to be able to see something of it. If there was no broadcast, the Mass would still happen. For many years, I've worked with the homeless, in Brighton, and they, of course, have very limited access to the internet. So it's not as if the broadcast mass in any way can, sort of help or affect them immediately. I do believe that the gospel is best spread by being lived and by being shared, really through the manifestation of charity and of mercy. And so a very old-fashioned concept of the corporal works of mercy and acts of charity. And I wish more Christians, in fact, personally, I believe all Christians should be actively involved and engaged in work like feeding and clothing and looking after the homeless, meeting and befriending the lonely, visiting the elderly, visiting the sick, etc. If you take visiting the sick, for example, it used to be, and there are vestiges left of, hospitals. The vestiges are there will be some kind of friends association or something, but which now is very nominal and probably spends its time with a handful of volunteers trying to fundraise for various bits of equipment. Whereas in the past, those friends associations in hospitals were teams of volunteers, of people who would go in to the hospital and visit those who had nobody to visit them, or to look out for on behalf of family, distant family and friends, a loved one who was in hospital, and were themselves a kind of extension of the pastoral care that the limited capacity of the chaplains would substitute. But with secularization and the introduction of health and safety regulations and so on and so forth, and now particularly safeguarding, for understandable reasons, one only has to think of the awful stories that came out about Jimmy Savile and his visiting children's homes and wards and things. Obviously, there will always be a threat. There will always be somebody who shouldn't be there. But through the enforcement of those kind of regulations and things, and through the secularization of our society, it's even now quite difficult for chaplains to interact with patients. Before, a chaplain could walk the hospital corridors and more or less speak and greet to anyone. Now everything is, you have to have a reason to interact with anyone. You can't just go up to someone and start talking to them. And there are all sorts of sensitivities. One has to be careful of cultural sensitivities or people's feelings, and so we've seen in court cases nurses and others who offered to pray for someone, and somebody objected to that. Not necessarily, and very rarely, the actual person that was offered to be prayed for, but other staff or visitors. There's this fear of proselytization abroad. So the idea is that a place like a hospital should be completely neutral, and anything that is perceived to affect that neutrality, one has to safeguard against.
Yeah,
but of course it means that we have people literally now in hospitals with nobody to visit them, and it can be even be difficult for a chaplain to visit them, because if they haven't identified themselves as a person of faith, if they haven't identified themselves with a particular denomination or religion, there's almost, difficult to justify why a chaplain should go and see them. And yet everybody will tell you, nurses will tell you, that the fortunes of an individual can be turned just by positive interactions with others. It can, affect them not just physiologically, physiologically it affects the whole person, so they can, develop a more positive attitude,
Yes.
and that can make a very big difference for elderly people.
I was just going to say, if you find, don't you, with elderly people who are on their own, if that they are not touched, and if
Yeah,
somebody were to give them a hug, it can be transformative.
yeah.
Just
But today that would raise alarm bells.
yeah, yeah. We're not
We've
we're not
become
very well.
overly protective. We've
Yeah,
become overly protective to the point of, and this is what I was referring to earlier about the anthropological dimension, so that we're kind of denying our humanity. Everybody talks about humanity and being inclusive and all the rest of it, but then we have all these rules and regulations that prevent us from being human.
Our Father, who art in heaven.
I attended the Unite the Kingdom rally with camera. In the front row of the waiting column of marchers, there was a line of clerics. Are you a bishop, sir?
Well, yes, I am. If we look at the Greek word episkopos, it means a bishop. So, yes, I'm a pastor of Oasis City Church. We've got churches in various places, Spain, Argentina, and around the world. And, yes, I'm a pastor and a leader of a charismatic Pentecostal church in Watford.
Tommy Robinson, who inspires this movement, seems very strongly to be turning and walking down a Christian pathway. I actually don't know how he identifies himself at the moment, but he clearly has garnered support.
Not far from here, there was a preacher back in the 18th century called George Whitfield. He preached for 40 to 60 hours a week out in the open air. 3 weeks ago, I preached in Watford, London, and was arrested by the police and detained in a prison cell for 12 hours. Because of preaching the gospel.
What sort of a world have we moved into, and where does
Absolutely.
this end?
I mean, I don't know, but I would be fairly certain he'll get off, because pretty much all the incidences, there have been quite a few in recent years of street preacher arrests. They've all got off. They've all been let go, with not even with a caution, but with an apology. The law at the moment is still our friend. So in terms of cases like street preachers, people who are arrested for allegedly praying in their heads outside, in abortion buffer zones, etc. So far, those cases have been won or overturned by judges. Likewise, we're beginning to see things turning around again because of law around trans ideology, so that the Supreme Court's clarification of what is meant by the term sex in the Equalities Act now means, of course, that there are great swathes of people in institutions and human resources departments panicking because their inclusive policies are actually illegal. So where they have, tried to create mixed toilets and not provide single sex spaces, etc., they have been and are acting illegally. Again, in the NHS, the Darlington nurses, and just recently another Muslim nurse who were, being told that they had to share their space with a man identifying as a woman. They've won their cases. That not only was that unlawful, but also constituted a form of harassment and a coercion and an imposition of an ideology. So of the kind of institutional framework of our society at the moment, the only pillar left standing, it would seem, is the law. But as you said, sadly, the Church of England and most of the mainstream denominations in this country are captured, ideologically captured.
That's a great segue into your path, because you're not going down the middle of the road as prescribed by the Roman Catholic Church in Broad. Tell us a little bit about your own spiritual journey, Doctor. Where were you? What age were you when you realised what you were going to want to become, and how have you ended up moving into, your own quite singular path with a small organisation?
I'd had a spiritual experience at the age of 6. And I couldn't say whether it was a dream or a vision or what it was, but it was pictorial. There was an image, a vision of some kind. And then at the age of 12, touring this abbey, the abbey had altars dedicated to various different saints and mysteries going around the building, and behind the high altar next to the Blessed Sacrament Chapel was depicted the image that I had seen at the age of 6, and that image is called Christ, the Eternal High Priest, and it's usually depicted a crucifix, but Christ, instead of being usually semi-naked and in torture, is instead presented dressed as a priest in mass vestments, and holding a chalice and a host. And that was the vision I'd seen age 6, and never saw again until I came to that altar dedicated to Christ the Eternal High Priest and saw that image. I burst into tears, and one of the monks took me into the Blessed Sacrament Chapel to talk with me, and I explained to him basically what I've just said now, and he said, sounds like you've definitely got a vocation. So from then on, I was kind of slightly obsessed with the faith. In fact, my nickname at school was the Vicar, so my O-levels and A-levels, I centred on history and religious studies. I'm also a musician, so I did first go and study music in Italy, and then came back to Wales and read divinity, biblical languages, as well as theology. And then, sort of continued with that, but at the same time was, discerning my vocation. And what I'd come to realize fairly early was there was something wrong in the church, because, sensing a vocation to priesthood, I started noticing, the liturgy. I was already, involved liturgically, as a server, as a chorister, but I really began to take note of the liturgy and to study the liturgy, and, discovered that there was a way of doing Mass that had been done for centuries that was changed, what then only, a decade or so before I'd come aware of it. That sort of blew my mind. I thought, hold on a minute, why the change? Why get rid of, because then of course I was seeing beautiful images, photographs in books and everything of the old mass and how it used to be said and how the priests and used to dress. And of course I understood that Schubert's Mass in G, Mozart's Coronation Mass, Haydn's Spatzen Mass, and all the rest of it were written for that kind of liturgy. And whenever I saw the new Mass, and even if it was celebrated in Latin, even if they had one of the classical Mass settings, it seemed to jar. It didn't. You'd think we'd sit there, and I'd sit there and I'd think, well, why are we sitting here listening to the choir sing for 20 minutes the Gloria, when we can say the Gloria, in like a minute and a half? Why are we sitting here listening to the thing? Through liturgical history, I discovered that, actually during the Gloria, other things used to go on, which is why, those classical older Mass settings are much longer, because there would be other stuff going on liturgically at that moment. But in the new Mass, none of that other stuff went on. So everybody just sat there listening to the choir sing a Palestrina Gloria for 20 minutes. And which seemed kind of daft, and it jarred. And I thought that this is wrong. There's something not right here. And in studying theology, discovering modernism, focusing myself particularly on Thomism, which has been the core philosophical and theological discipline in Catholicism since the time of Aquinas. But again, studying church history and everything, noting all these changes in attitudes and suddenly this introduction of ambiguity in language, doctrinally, and then all these, the new Mass and the new liturgies and things. And I thought this isn't quite right. And then I discovered Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre and his Society of St. Pius X. He had been excommunicated by John Paul II because he not only refused to say the new Mass, but set up a seminary and was training priests deliberately for the traditional Mass to keep it going.
Wow.
But not only to keep the Mass going, but also to keep the faith going, the traditional doctrine going. Mm-hmm. So, for an obvious example, today, of course, we hear about ecumenism all the time. Everything's ecumenical since the 60s. Prior to the 60s, though, the official position doctrinally of the Catholic Church was, if you were not a Catholic, you pretty much weren't thought of as a Christian. So, if you weren't, no salvation outside the church was the motto. But since the 60s, of course, it's anything goes. In Catholicism, strictly speaking, not strictly speaking, doctrinally, there is the idea of the ordination of women is just not theologically possible. But then, last month, Sarah Mullally, the new Archbishop of Canterbury, was received in Rome and treated just the same as if she'd been one of her male predecessors, or even a Catholic bishop. So that at one point, she was visiting the tomb of St. Peter, and the curial clergy, so, who are bishops and archbishops who work in the Vatican, obviously, with her because of the diplomacy and everything. But they had a short prayer service and she gave a blessing, and they all crossed themselves as if they were receiving that blessing. Now, of course, but in Catholic theology, she can't give a blessing. There is no blessing. She can say the words and move her arms, but it doesn't actually mean anything. And that's, and this is, something that Marcel Lefebvre took a particular stand on, because before his excommunication in 1988, the Assisi prayer conference had happened in Assisi, hosted by John Paul II, where leaders from all religions had come together, ostensibly to pray for peace. But John Paul II had allowed, for example, the Buddhists to pray in one of the churches. And they didn't just go in and have a quiet prayer. They took a statue of Buddha and put it on the altar.
My word.
And, all these sorts of things, which, completely contradictory to where the church was before.
You take a hard line on all this, do you? Is it black and white for you? Ecumenical,
yes and no.
Ecumenism is perhaps from a warm heart, but it muddies waters, would you say? Does it confuse?
Yeah. It relativizes. It relativizes. So that, the most common comment you'll hear these days from people about ecumenism is, well, I don't know why we aren't just all one, because, you believe in Jesus, I believe in Jesus, we're one effectively, aren't we? So, so why can't I, just receive communion in your church? And there are very good reasons why not just anybody can receive Holy Communion in a Catholic church, because of St. Paul's admonition in Corinthians about a judgment that's eaten and drunk on oneself by eating the blood, by not recognizing the body and blood of Christ, and eating and drinking unworthily. So, that's why there is an injunction against open communion for us as Catholics. But all those things are, well, they haven't improved, and clearly, the reception of the Archbishop of Canterbury a month or so ago just shows that they've gotten worse, and that's why I basically joined a traditionalist enclave, and we very much see our position as trying to maintain and preserve and continue what was, for the sake of now and for the future, because it seems obvious that what we're seeing in wider society is also reflected in and will happen in the church, where this where modernism will essentially destroy, will tear things up. We've seen it in the Church of England already with the ordination of women, divide, a third of the clergy left, and quite a few laity as well. And we're seeing in the Catholic Church an impending schism with Germany. The Catholic Church in Germany has gone uber progressivist, and it is actually at the moment openly defying the Vatican on the understanding of or interpretation of Pope Francis's granting of blessings to people in same-sex unions. Now, the official line is supposedly that we're not blessing the union, we're blessing the persons in the union.
Right.
But the church in Germany, the progressive church in Germany, has decided to read that as, this is a blessing of homosexual union, effectively. Because what does it mean? You can bless unions, but you're only blessing the individuals in it. You know, it is ambiguous.
We're in very complicated cultural territories right here, aren't we? Are you in the older school of thinking, viewing women as not, for some reason, historic or whatever, appropriate as priests and bishops? Have I read that?
Yes, yes. So it's not about whether a woman could do the job or not. The point is, it's not a job. The point is, the priest is an icon of Christ, and the mystery of the incarnation is that God became man as a man. But when you think about it, the balance comes with the complementarity between our Lord and the Blessed Virgin, because how could God become man, but without being born of woman? And what can a man not do? Give birth. Now you don't see, men, even progressive men, or not many, progressive men, clamoring to be able to be titled mothers, or to demand surgery to enable them to give birth, etc. And that's not because the ability to do that isn't there, because it is. But there's a complementarity between the sexes. So from a Catholic perspective, God's plan of salvation, we see a complementarity, and it's being brought about through the male side of humanity and the female side of humanity, represented by Jesus and by Mary. And then by extension, a kind of historical and cultural perspective would be, nobody loves Mary more than Catholics do, but nobody would claim that she was ever a priest, or that Jesus would ever have made her a priest.
Right.
And if you like, so it's sort of, there are, it's just not possible for a woman to be an icon of Christ, just as it's not possible for a man to give birth, to give life.
Yeah. Amongst my meanderings, I came across Hermetic philosophy, and it's based on 7 principles. The first of which is the idea that the all, which is how it lands in English, meaning the universe, but particularly the universes, because I think science is agreeing that there are multiple universes. Perhaps there are universes without number. Why wouldn't there be? The infinite is the infinite, and it's ineffable, and that's a problem. But we carry on talking about it, even though we know we can't ever express it. And then we're almost in a Sam Beckett play, but I'll pause there. So it begins with this idea that the all is in the mind of God, which is it's the mentalism. It's a brilliant idea, because it's pretty much irrefutable, I think. And then there are various ideas which have a quasi-scientific ring to them about polarity and rhythm and so on, which you can see apply at a micro-scientific level, but can also be understood societally, I think, and over sort of not geological time, which of course is too vast for us to comprehend in a lived experience way, but in our own civilizational terms. And the 7th of the 7 is about gender, and the 7th Hermetic principle affirms male and female, and by that we are to understand that that form of gender is in everything that is made manifest, which is, I don't mean it as a pun, but it is a seriously cosmic thought that is very difficult to take up and run with, because it's so big. And I just love the idea that science and spirituality are coming together slowly. There was a very fine American physicist called Richard Feynman, and I bumped into him, I don't know, 4 decades ago, with a film on BBC about him. And he's a remarkable man, and he would affirm that sort of idea. And as he explores the physical and the subatomic realms, they become things of mystery and beauty, not randomness.
Well, and you see, when you think how we describe the sacrament of matrimony, the two persons, the male and the female, become one. And if you think about that, obviously by extension, biologically, their coming together will bring new life.
Yeah.
So you have, two parts, one whole, that generates life.
Yin and yang.
And again, societally, so, again, a phrase we often hear in the church. I know ecumenists use it all the time, but, we are one body. There is one Lord, there is one church, there's one faith, one baptism. There is, we are one body. Though we are many, we are one body. Perhaps, I think people forget that a whole, is made of parts. And, we, all of us, have a part to play together. That other glib phrase, expression, that no man is an island. And it's true. I mean, that's not to say that, you can't be. Yes, you can. You can take yourself off to an island literally and isolate yourself from everybody else. Of course you can. You can do that if you want to. But is that the fullness of human experience? And this is kind of the problem I think we have. The zeitgeist is me, myself, and I. It's very insular. And which is why there's so much loneliness, and I also, but also so much, I think, mental distress, because we're not interacting with each other as we ought to, which means rather than that this works as for I mean, it works. But, using technology, but really, we should experience each other.
Yes, exactly. And so this very conversation we're having is in fact an illustration of the problem, you might say, because it's a partial coming together, but it's not the whole. And it can never be. But the world seems to be atomizing.
Yeah, and if we think about our experiences of COVID, one of the biggest things that people really struggled with was not being able to be in each other's presence.
Quite.
The harshest lockdowns that had the most significant psychological impact were those that forbid us from being basically in the presence of others or limiting our presence with others.
I was thinking before this conversation, the phrase kept coming into my head: when 2 or 3 are gathered together in my presence, I will be there. Or those aren't the precise words, are they? But that's right, isn't it? And I was thinking, well, I'm really looking forward to meeting Dr. Lloyd and having this theological exploratory conversation. But we're not actually together. I don't know. I mean, it's still sharing, and it has value. It's not the whole deal somehow.
Yes, quite.
What do we do about that? Will you be taking your mission back out into the world more fully as time goes by, do you think? Or will it now, do you see the path being this extraordinary hybrid of faith and technology, which does reach out and connect and is efficient?
Well, see, this is the issue, isn't it? Is that, we need to use it to meet people where they are, to find people where they are.
Yeah.
And everyone's online. um, um, so yes, I think a hybrid approach is something, I mean, failing some kind of, disaster, which means that you know we can no longer use technology in this way. I think a hybrid going forward is probably inevitable now. I think part of the problem with online is that it's no longer a tool for many people. It is how they experience life.
Yeah, exactly.
You know, that's
Hmm.
that's the problem with it's like with AI and ChatGPT. Most of my colleagues absolutely despair about those things. But I say, well, but they're tools. As tools and used as tools, they could
Mm.
be incredibly useful and
Yeah,
incredibly effective. But as tools, what you can't do, what you shouldn't do, is, for example, the issue with schools is kids using, basically asking AI to write their essays for them instead of using AI to help them write their
yeah.
essay.
Mm.
And that's the difference. And the trouble is for kids, really, since the millennium, their whole life really is experienced through IT.
The thin end of the wedge, in a sense, was the pocket calculator, I think, where suddenly you didn't have to do multiplication and long division because you could just press a few buttons. But
Yes.
well, I remember grappling with those things, learning the times tables by rote. And I've never
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
regretted that, because I can handle things in a shop. I know when
Yeah,
somebody's
quite.
shortchanged me.
Absolutely.
And
Yes,
other
that's very
people
true.
say, "Well, how do you know how much that was? Maybe I bought two things and I added up the two things and got the answer. But, some
Yeah.
people now think that's extraordinary, which I
Yeah.
think is awful.
I remember thinking at the time, at school, I'll never use this, I'm never going to use algebra, I'm never going to use, you know. But then later on, much later when I was studying philosophy and logic, then suddenly algebra made, made some sense.
Yeah.
But otherwise, in everyday life as well. I mean, one of the things I had here until COVID, I was running here until COVID, was a social enterprise where we had franchise kitchens in pubs and gave mentoring jobs to people off the streets, and would mentor them through MVQs in catering, because of course in Brighton here where I am, there's a big hospitality trade, and for the scheme that was delivering the MVQ component, there had to be, actually it was required by the government, there had to be a numeracy and literacy element that people had to pass. So they couldn't, it wasn't just about the practical stuff of catering. They also, had to reach a certain level of literacy and numeracy. So often we would apply mathematical ideas and principles to catering. For example, percentages or fractions, slicing cake. Slicing cake. Because of course, if you slice a cake in half, that gives you 50% either side. You slice it four ways evenly, then you get a quarter, so on and so forth. And people who'd really struggled at school with maths,
Mm.
suddenly this it all made sense.
Wow. Yeah. Four bits of
Yeah.
cake. Marvelous.
But just through application.
Just to round up our conversation, Dr. Lloyd, I wonder, how do we broker a conversation with those who have no belief in what in AA land they call higher power, which is a nice phrase because it introduces people to a key concept of an other thing, an other force, and another very beneficial creative force and motor for life, in which they come to trust.
I mean, I think going back to, as it were, almost to the very beginning when you were describing the various different ways and routes that people might discern God, discerning through intellectual exploration, discerning through observation of nature, discerning through interactions and relationships with others, etc. I sincerely believe that people can come. St. Paul actually taught it. Everything points to him. And if you can encourage people to ponder or dwell long enough on one of those aspects, sure enough, they will have to come to him. So scientists, for example, more and more scientists are coming to faith, because the more and more they can see, the more and more they realize, as we said before, well, on the balance of probabilities, this is ridiculous. Although we can see, universes within universes, within universes, within universes, etc., into infinitum, but it suggests there's something more. And again, if somebody contemplating nature, whether they're focusing on a particular creature, something created, whether a tree or a plant or whatever, an animal, or whether they consider the bigger picture of environment and the ecosystems. Again, I think if you dwell upon it long enough, you begin to realize, you see patterns, you see logic, and you think, well, hold on a minute, this points to a higher mind. And likewise, I think, and this is key, likewise, I think, spending more time with other people will actually enable you to see the divine, to glimpse the divine. Most especially in acts of kindness and charity, where people act against themselves for the sake of another, when people behave and act sacrificially rather than selfishly.
I remember somebody quoting the remark of one of these pithy aphoristic things, see God in everyone. And I'm often reminded that if I'm feeling cross, or I get my mind gets in a whir about an individual.
Two more things along those lines.
Not easy.
As Christians, we believe that everyone has a guardian angel. Desmond Tutu used to say, so therefore, imagine that everyone you see, there is an angel with them.
Marvelous. What a great place to arrive at.
and then lastly, Mother Teresa, or now Saint Teresa of Calcutta. She was interviewed, and she was asked, the interviewer had been following her, treating the people, the dying, some of them, all sorts of diseases, leprosy, etc. And they said to her, Mother, how can you embrace a leper? How can you embrace, how can you touch these people, etc.? And she said, well, I try to see Jesus in them, and him I serve.
As do you.
And that's it, we are made in the image of God.
Yeah.
And I think in acts of selflessness, we see that reflection of him in each other.
Dr. Lloyd, thank you so much for joining me on this podcast and sharing what is your great warm motor for life.
You're very welcome. Thank you for having me. How could God become man, but without being born of woman? The incarnation is that God became man as a man.